The largest military assault in the history of mankind begins on a front 2,400 kilometers wide, stretching across the territory of Soviet Russia. The bombing of airfields and railways, and of advancing Russian troops. German troops crossed the border and entered Estonia on the 16th day of the war on July 7th, 1941. The Estonian people were filled with the hope that they would be liberated from the horrors of the Red Year and that Estonian independence would be restored. Estonian men, resistance fighters, some 6,000 to 7,000 forest brothers, as they were known, managed to liberate much of Estonia. Then the German attack got bogged down. This gave the Red Army time to press 33,000 men into service in northern Estonia. Soviet destroyer battalions employed scorched earth tactics. Troops belonging to destroyer battalions from Latvia entered the part of Estonia where we lived. There were 4 homesteaders in our farm, and someone must have pointed us out and told them we were hiding in the woods. They came looking. On 3 occasions they came and torched farms. They bayoneted my uncle and cousin and threw them into a local river. My mother asked about my husband's fate. She knew that he'd been shot. On the same day I was arrested on the 3rd of July. I don't know if it was a coincidence or not. Because of a quick advance, destruction of many cultural treasures by the Soviet troops was avoided. It turned out that there had been a mass murder at the Viljandi prison. I saw it with my own eyes, a big, deep, square grave in the prison shed. I recall that there were 14 corpses. On top of the heap was a young boy of 12 or 13. He was without his trousers, he had been beaten and was bruised. Hastily, we started to reconstitute the Home Guard. We met a couple of men through Colonel Raudmäe. He was the chief of the Home Guard. Attack on Tallinn. A number of young single men were ready to go to war right away. In fact, several of them did. They joined German units and went to the front. Marching into Tallinn. Citizens are greeting our soldiers as liberators from Bolshevik subjugation. German troops, along with forest brothers, arrived in Tallinn on August 28th. The people hoped for the return of independence. Former Prime Minister Uluots presented the German command with a memorandum calling for the reinstatement of independence. In a verbal reply, they said Germany wouldn't allow governments to be re-established in the occupied eastern territories. Still, the Germans didn't forbid the use of the Estonian coat of arms and flag beside the swastika flag. They didn't ban the national anthem. The symbols were now of extreme importance to the people. Rejoicing, they greeted the German occupiers who had delivered them from the clutches of deporters and killers, not as in Paris a year earlier, where the people had looked on in mute silence as the Germans marched in. The Forest Brothers had already managed to drive Soviet occupation forces out of parts of Estonia. Over 500 resistance members were killed in the fighting. On a local level, the administrative hierarchy of the pre-war Estonian Republic was re-established. Tallinn had been in a state of siege since August the 7th. The communists evacuated by sea. They took lots of valuable items and the men who had been forcibly conscripted in Tallinn with them. Artillery opened fire on them from the coast. Clouds of smoke and steam from the burning and sinking ships on the horizon. Warplanes joined in the destruction. 17 warships and 43 troop carriers have been destroyed. Another 54 vessels have been severely damaged. Almost 200 red ships left Tallinn and Paldiski for Kronstadt. A quarter of them were destroyed. The Bolshevik divisions who had fought in Estonia have been destroyed. The battle for Tallinn and Paldiski became the Dunkirk of the Baltic Sea for the Soviets. The roadsides were littered with the abandoned arms and vehicles of the retreating Soviets. Soviet commando units worked feverishly to try to destroy equipment and anything else of utility that might fall into enemy hands. Most of the Soviets were either taken prisoner or they perished in the waters of the Baltic Sea. When the battle was over, about 12,000 prisoners had been taken into custody. This is the causeway that joins the islands of Muhu and Saaremaa. Over this causeway, partially destroyed by the enemy, Captain Pankov moved with his company of infantry, a decision he took independently, from Muhu to the eastern part of Saaremaa, and thereby created the conditions for successful action in conquering the island. The Germans took possession of the Estonian islands in September and October. Sites of mass murders committed by the Reds had already been discovered on the mainland. Red Terror had claimed the lives of 2,200 victims in Estonia, of all ages. Most of them were killed after the beginning of the war. Attack on Kuressaare, the capital of Saaremaa. This is Kuressaare, an ancient castle of a German order of knights. Saaremaa was under Soviet control the longest. They carried out more crimes there. In 1941, the Soviets had tortured people at the castle. I saw that too. I attended high school during the German period. To see the victims was awful. It makes me sick even now. I couldn't stay there more than a minute. I left. The hands of most of the women were tied behind their backs with barbed wire. The women's breasts had been amputated. Some were still hanging there. Pins had been pushed into their noses. One had pins under each of her fingernails, where it's the most painful. They were in the well of the courtyard, where there is an old cellar facing the seaside, and in a number of other cellars. One of the wells was completely full of bodies. There was another big cellar where a hunting club is now situated, and they had tortured people there too. During the German period, couches were on display, all covered with blood and traces of stabbing where people had been bayoneted. The couches were riddled with holes, the springs were showing. A party was thrown for the members of the town Komsomol. They didn't know that an orchestra was playing where the hunting club is now, and right there underneath, to drown out the screaming of people, they were made to dance. 90 people were found killed in Kuressaare, mainly in the courtyard of the castle. The dead were removed to the courtyard, and I went to see. It made me nauseous. I thought it just can't continue like this. I joined voluntarily to avenge their deaths. We were sent to Russia in the month of April. First we went to Oudova. At the beginning of the war, high and mighty Greater Germany didn't need any reinforcements of its military forces. Estonian volunteers were assigned to patrol in the rear in Russia. A Waffen-SS unit of Estonian volunteers. 2 of us went from our village. I went with the brother of a guy I'd been in the resistance with. 8 boys were from a neighboring village. There were more of them there. There were leaders and those who set examples. For instance,